One of the repeated themes and motifs in the Bible is the journey of someone geographically for a purpose. We could, of course, talk about the journeys of people's character as they were shaped and molded, but this is, in a literal sense, journeys from one place to another. If you stop and think about it, there are a lot of them, and they're very important. First off, of course, is the journey of Abraham with Sarah and Lot from Ur to Canaan, because God said, come out, Abraham, go. This is where I want you to go. And then later on, Abraham and Sarah went down to Egypt and back because of a famine. Later, he sent Eleazar, his servant, back to Mesopotamia to get a wife for his son Isaac. He went there and brought Rebekah back. Then Jacob, a generation later, had to flee to Mesopotamia because of how he'd done his brother Esau wrong, and he went there, and that's where he found Leah and Rachel. Generation later, Joshua goes down to Egypt, not by choice, but because his brothers sold him into slavery, but he was there preparing the way for the famine that would come when his whole family came down to Egypt during the famine. And then, of course, 400 years later, Moses leads the people of Israel up out of Egypt. One of the defining moments of the Jewish nation is the journey from Egypt to the Promised Land. And of course, that journey had a 40-year period of wandering in the desert that happened because of their disobedience. But after that generation, Joshua led the people across the Jordan and into the Promised Land. A little bit later, you have the story of Ruth and Naomi, because Naomi's family had gone to Moab during a famine. There's a lot of famines. And then they came back with Ruth, where she found Boaz and the blessing of God. And then the book of Jonah is about two separate journeys, one in the wrong direction and one in the right direction, through disobedience and then obedience. Then you have the captivity of the nation of Judah in Babylon, the people being physically taken to Babylon for 70 years. And then they come back under Ezra and Nehemiah. And once you get to the New Testament, you have similar themes. We're going to be talking about one of them, of course, today. But after this text, Mary and Joseph will flee to Egypt and then come back. And then later on, John will go out into the wilderness to preach. And then Jesus will go into the wilderness for his temptation. And then the narrative of the story of the Bible ends with the missionary journeys of Paul and Barnabas and Silas and the rest of the early missionaries going throughout the Roman world and beyond with the gospel. Many, many journeys for a purpose. And so as we look at our text today of the Gospel of Luke chapter 2, we will see just that. First three verses say this: In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. This was the first census that took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria, and everyone went to their own town to register. Luke tells us about the days of Caesar Augustus. This is actually Octavian Caesar. He took upon himself the name of Caesar Augustus after he was adopted by his uncle Julius Caesar. Octavian was born in 63 BC and lived to 14 AD. He was the undisputed and unchallenged ruler of Rome at the point of where the narrative is here today. He was actually an extremely effective leader. He ushered in a time of peace and prosperity in the empire known as the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. But at the same time, he ended the Republic, brought in the era of the imperial emperors, and really put an end to that representative form of government. So they basically traded security and peace for freedom and choice, at least amongst the class that had the right to choose. Augustus Caesar sat at the height of human power and glory, Few human beings in the history of the world have had his authority, his glory, his power. So much so that he was able to declare his uncle Julius to be divine. And worship of Julius began within the empire, and then later he himself would be recognized as divine. We have the start of the cult of emperor worship, the cult that will later challenge the church because Christians will be persecuted and many executed for refusing to worship the emperors. So Augustus Caesar sitting atop the pinnacle of human achievement. And there is a census of the Roman world. And when we talk about the Roman world, we're of course not talking about the whole known world, because of course they had plenty of contacts with India, with Africa and other places beyond the empire. But it was the world's most powerful and largest empire that had ever been seen. Alexander's empire was incredible, but it was built quickly and it crumbled shortly after his death and broke into pieces. The Roman Empire, everyone thought, would never fall. It was so powerful. It was so well entrenched. And it had those all-powerful legions maintaining it if anybody got out of line. Here we see that Quirinius was the governor in Syria. We know that Herod is a king, but he is a king with quotation marks. He is a king because he bought his kingdom from Rome, and he is a client king. He is not really technically in charge. The Roman governor sits above him, even though he's but a governor and Herod is a king. Quirinius was governor from 6 to 4 BC, and that's the time period we're in, and also again from 6 to 9 AD. Everyone goes to their hometown to register for this census. This is, of course, a census to determine taxation. The Romans were very efficient in making sure everybody paid their taxes. It also was for military service, so that they could draft you into the legions if they wanted you. However, the Jews had been granted an exception. You did not have to serve in the Roman military if you were Jewish. So this would not apply to Joseph. But he had to go to his hometown to register, as we'll see in a minute, which is really not a big deal for most people. Until the modern era, most people lived and died within a day's walk of where they were born. Very few people traveled. Very few people did what I did in the middle of my life and moved 6 hours away for a job, for a new opportunity. Most people simply stayed where they were. So we have a census in the Roman Empire. Verse 4, we see where it affects this ongoing story of the coming of the Christ. It says, "So Joseph also went up from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to Bethlehem, the town of David, because he belonged to the house and line of David." So we have Joseph, who according to the Gospel of Matthew has now received that vision from the angel of the Lord telling him why and how Mary became pregnant, and he has accepted her as his wife instead of divorcing her. So they are united. They're going from Nazareth in the north in Galilee up to Bethlehem in the Judean hill country, which is also another small town. I've seen estimates of this being anywhere from 3 to a 5-day journey on foot. We always, in the pictures, have Mary riding a donkey. Have no idea if they had the means for that or not. The text doesn't tell us. But they travel there to the town of David. You know how when you go into a town, they put something on the sign that they want people to know about their town? Right, home of the whatever, and various state championships are on there and all sorts of stuff. I was somewhat amused as I came here to Pennsylvania and started driving around to see that pretty much everywhere around here, George Washington was at some point. Because those Washington Trail signs are everywhere. I think he walked in circles. The man must needed a compass. But everybody wants to say George Washington was here. I noticed that we don't have a sign coming into Franklin. John Wilkes Booth used to live here. I don't know why. But everybody wants to claim their fame, right? Birthplace of this athlete or that president or whatever. Everyone wants to know that. Bethlehem forever has that right. I don't know if they had a sign coming into town saying, boom, birthplace of David. Everybody else take a back seat, because this is a big deal. By far the most famous son of Bethlehem to this point in history. Because, of course, David was the renowned king of Israel. Solomon had the glory of his riches and his wisdom, but David is held above him, because David has a whole life story that is amazing, right? He starts as a little boy fighting Goliath and winning, and then he has all his other victories as Saul's top general. And then he flees from Saul all those years and has all these amazing escapes. And then, of course, on top of that, on top of being king, David is the one that writes all of those amazing psalms that the Jewish nation was still singing. A king, a warrior, a poet, everybody loved David. And so Joseph and Mary are at the city of David, Bethlehem, because he belonged to the house and line of David. We don't know how many descendants of David there were currently living in Joseph's day, but it was a decent number. It has been nearly 1,000 years since David. There are a good number of people that can trace their ancestry back to David one way or another. Joseph is one of them. And so therefore Joseph, along with the others, has the right to sit on that throne, if that throne were available, which it of course is not. But God had promised David that his line would never end, that his kingdom would never end, and that one day one would sit upon that throne forever. Joseph went there to register with Mary, who was pledged to be married to him and was expecting a child. We, of course, have been talking about Mary. We remember that she is the recipient of God's favor, that she was the one chosen by God to bear the Son of God. They are pledged to be married. Matthew makes it clear to us that Mary was known to be pregnant before their marriage was finalized, and it will not be fully consummated until after the birth of Jesus. So even though Joseph was willing to take Mary home as his wife, their official marriage does not begin until after the birth of Jesus. She's expecting a child, which is, of course, what would have been scandalous back in Nazareth. Even though they were pledged and that was legally binding, they were supposed to be abstaining until after the actual wedding celebration. And of course, everyone would have assumed that that was what they had failed to do. We're told that she is expecting a child, and as we know, that's going to be soon and very soon. She's very much expecting a child. Of course, as you know, and as I remember from my own family's experience, dates are what they are. Nicole was not a happy camper that it was 2 weeks after her expected due date. And I remember telling people that I was supposed to preach on Palm Sunday for the community service. I said, okay, but I got to have a backup because my wife is due, a week from now, and you never know. Of course, it was more than 3 weeks later. I didn't need worry because we had time. God brought Joseph and Mary here for this purpose. He could have done it a different way, right? He could have just given them a vision or a dream and said, go to Bethlehem for the birth of the child. They could have just gone on their own. But instead he said, you know what? I'm going to do this. I'm going to use this census. I'm going to use this Roman governor's taxation scheme, and I will bring them there. And here we have the finale of our text this morning. While they were there, the time came for the baby to be born, and she gave birth to her firstborn, a son. She wrapped him in cloths and placed him in a manger because there was no guest room available for them. Of course, it happened while they were there because that's the appropriate place. It's the appointed time. This is the will of God unfolding, and so everything happens as it is meant to be. She gives birth to her firstborn. Obviously, it's her firstborn, right? Because she said to the angel, how can I have a child? I'm a virgin. So obviously, this is her firstborn. and that he's also a son, because of course we knew he was going to be a son. The angel told him, I've got a name already picked out. His name will be Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. The name was already chosen. We knew it was going to be a boy. And we also, of course, already know, because it's ubiquitous with Christmas, that he was born in a manger. And that is where she placed him, in that animal trough to keep him warm, we assume with some straw on the outside, and she wraps him in the clothes and places him there. It's a place of relative dryness, a place of relative warmth that Mary and Joseph were afforded. These were ordinary people, Mary and Joseph. They were not rich. They were not well connected. They were not privileged in any way. And so when it came time for the King of Kings and Lord of Lords to enter into this world, he entered in with the status of his parents, his adopted father Joseph and his mother Mary, a humble birth in the city of David. So much so that there wasn't even a guest room available for them. Other texts call it room at the inn. They didn't exactly have chains of hotels back then. Bethlehem was a small village. They must have only had a few places, and those would have been taken up by people that journeyed a shorter distance. Remember, they came all the way after they heard about the census, all the way down from Galilee. Some people probably only had to go one day's journey away because they hadn't gone nearly as far. Something drove Joseph's ancestors, his father or grandfather, whoever it was, sent them north to Galilee, and now he's come back home, the prodigal son, as it were. Nothing that Joseph did had anything to do with it, but he's come home to his own clan, to his relatives. He would have many cousins and aunts and uncles in this town, and he has come home, but there's no place for him. We don't know if they were snubbed. We don't know if the rooms went to people that had more money or anything like that, because that's not the focus. The focus isn't on what other people did. The focus is on the entrance of the Christ child into this world, as humble a birth as can be imagined. Remember that when the Magi go to Jerusalem, he's not there. He's not born in the capital. He's not born at the palace. And of course, Herod has no idea what they're talking about. He is born in a simple stable and placed there in a manger by his mother. We will see tomorrow night about the angels heralding his birth out to the shepherds. But this is a humble entrance into earth by the King of Kings, and it's entirely on purpose. Two thoughts I want us to take with us as we go away from here this morning. Number one, that Bethlehem is the birthplace of Jesus as the Messiah is absolutely not a coincidence. It's entirely part of the program. And then secondly, the humble circumstances of the birth of Jesus. We know that he is the very Son of God. We know that he will be the Messiah, the one with all this power to work miracles, to raise the dead, walk on water. But he enters into this world humbly and lives his whole life that way. A life of service, a life of sacrifice, a life of walking dusty roads as he teaches and heals the people. Not a life of luxury, not a life of privilege, a life of humility. And he will exit this world even more humbly, dying the death, rejected and alone of a criminal. But we also know that when he returns one day, it will not be in these humble circumstances. It will be with glory unlike anything this world has ever known. He came into this world humbly. He lived a life humbly. He died even more humbly. But he will return one day in glory to judge the living and the dead, as the Creed says.